Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on the last will and testament of Senhor Silva, Araújo by Germano Almeida. And this is a really interesting novel. It's a book that attempts to unspool a character's life. The titular character, Senhor Silva Araújo, or throughout the text he's often referred to as Senhor Nepomuceno. And so we get his singular experiences, his life, his identity, the choices he made, the way he triumphs as a businessman, the way that his life is in some ways a farce. But it's also a book about how the city around him is developing, how the economy of Cape Verde is growing. And throughout the middle of the 20th century, we see those changes paralleling the changes in his own life or the lack of changes in his own life. And so that interesting contrast really works on a number of levels. It's also a book that has this warm voice. There's a tension in Almeida's writing where on the one hand, he's trying to be funny at times. We have again, an old man who has passed away. And in his final will and testament, he's trying to have a sense of humor about his life, about the choices he's made, the mistakes he's made. But there's also a detached irony that exists from the narrator. And we have the contrast of other characters remembering the same events and remembering them in different ways from what Nepomuceno recalls as he writes out his last will. So it is an interesting book. There are aspects of little like puzzles that end up resolved within the narrative, and it's one that I would certainly recommend. Now, to give a sense of this character, we begin with the reading of his last will and testament, and he's been a wealthy man. He seems to have sort of kept to himself, never had a family, never had any children, and so they're going to read this last will and testament, and it takes hours. It's hundreds of pages long. And so the lawyer who's reading it has to stop, and someone else takes over and keeps reading, and then a third person tries to finish the reading all across this long afternoon. And then there are surprises contained within it, including, of course, the fact that he has a daughter that he never really helped raise, but that he is going to leave everything to. And so that sort of sets into motion all of these memories, people recalling various aspects of his success. His nephew, who feels furious that he hasn't received the inheritance, sharing little aspects. The daughter, she's introduced. We learn about her experiences. Who was her mother? How did her mother and Senor Nepomuceno have this relationship? And so there's almost this Citizen Kane effect going on, where we have conflicting ideas around the life and experiences of this titular character. But again, that warm humor, in many ways, the voice of Senor Nepomuceno feels like the voice of an older person, someone who's mature, who can look back and seems to be very transparent about his choices and his foibles. And yet that contrast of the other characters introduces this mystery around, wait a second, this reliable old man maybe isn't so reliable. But let's give a sample of the writing. Though he was prepared and duty-bound never to forgive Carlos the cruel sarcasm with which his nephew had wounded him on that radiant morning, and which struck him just as the atomic bomb had struck Hiroshima, he also considered it his duty to declare that, in fact, he had made too much of the benefits of science and technology, at least as regards our islands, because in the end he'd concluded that the same hand that makes small, marvelous things to delight us makes the most murderous instruments of man's destruction. And following this line of thought, it could as easily be said that we're so poor our docks aren't even equipped with a crane. As that poor we may be, but at least we don't run the risk of self-destruction. So since it seemed to him that the most important thing was to preserve the placidity of the islands, this backwater of a lost paradise, we must force ourselves to fight tooth and nail against all attempts to place our basic security in danger, because what's the use in achieving all the wealth in the world if a man loses his soul? No fortune is enough to make up for the loss of our peace and quiet. And so there's a generational divide between Senor Nepomuceno and his nephew Carlos, but there's also this sense that he recalls arriving, onto a larger island where there seems to be the potential for a job, and he doesn't even really have shoes. And the way that he begins to work his way up and slowly acquire wealth, slowly get a job as an assistant and learn who's who can I bribe, who's gonna pass this shipment through customs. And so gradually he begins to acquire more and more wealth, and he wants to be civically minded. And so we have this growth, and it really does parallel the growth of his business and of the city. The way that his house is constructed, sort of out on the outskirts of town, and it's up on the top of the mountain. You have to walk your way up, and it wears everyone out to do it. And in a sense, it's a parallel of how he has spent his entire life sort of acquiring wealth, climbing this mountain to reach the top and realize that there's no one else there with him. And so there's a tragedy underlying so many of the scenes that seem humorous. In another passage, he recalls the way that he had success as a businessman. As he later lamented, not everything went as he would have wished, because the rain did not continue to fall as it had in those early days, which had been the days of plenty, of umbrellas and glee and cops in the streets. The very night of the champagne, 2 thunderstorms exploded over the city, and the rain poured down cruelly with unprecedented and brutal force, as if all of a sudden it had tired of coming down softly, and by dawn a fierce gale was blowing. In the morning, all you saw were people shivering in the streets of the city, fallen trees, destroyed homes, whole families on the roofs of their houses, or on whatever was left of them. Later, it was estimated that at least 50 people had disappeared in the floods that passed through the streets of the city, but the furious waters still rushed in search of the sea, held back only by the walls of Calvino. For the rest of his life, Senhor Nepomuceno was unable to convince himself that he hadn't been responsible for that tragedy. And even during his periods of spiritual retreat, he was unable to console himself with the idea that one man's meat is another man's poison. Because when he tried to let himself off the hook, he hadn't even knowingly been responsible for the importation of all those umbrellas that might call down heavy rains. His guilty conscience reminded him of the incredible and undreamt of profit he had made, because he knew that with the sale of 2,000, he'd paid for 10,000. And so we learn the origin story of this successful businessman, that he had accidentally ordered too many umbrellas. And then the once in a generation storm came and rushed across the islands of Cape Verde. There was so much rain that the umbrellas, that they were the only company with umbrellas, and they started this little ad on the radio, and suddenly they sell out and they make a huge amount of profit. How do I invest this? How do I, in a sense, assuage myself of what I feel is this guilt? And he attempts to do that throughout his life, but we see that at every opportunity where he has this chance to sort of, in a sense, in his mind, make amends for what has happened, he never quite goes all the way through with it. And we see that in how he and his cleaning woman at his business have a relationship, and how that is essentially sexual assault. And that is how he has this daughter that he never really helps raise. When he goes and tries to, get closer to his daughter and recognize who she is and is she successful, we learn from her memories that she doesn't remember him as this kindly old man. She remembers him as someone who she thought was trying to seduce her, never realizing it was her father. And so that constant conflict of his memory, this warm, life that was never quite fulfilled, but sure had a lot happening in it, versus how everyone else perceives his life is really quite sad on a number of levels. And we see the destruction that he's been responsible for in a way that does not call to mind the storm that he didn't bring down, but rather how he personally was a storm in others' lives and ruined some. He recalls as well the one time one of the 2 times he thought he was in love. On the return trip, he had more than enough time to reflect that because halfway the ship hit a calm and took 14 days to get to São Vicente, he ended up concluding that he had been wrong not to declare himself openly to Dona Joia, who, through certain words and looks that he patiently and passionately recalled on board, would certainly have been receptive to his offer, not of an immediate courtship, of course, but at least of a warm and friendly correspondence. And he decided that as soon as he got to São Vicente, he would put a long letter to Dona Joia in the mail, which, not directly yet, but at least between the lines, would give her to understand his love. He thought of writing her phrases like these: "Unfortunately, it is still impossible for me to reciprocate those agreeable days spent in your company, because destiny, which has protected me in many material ways, this would serve to make her grasp his solid economic standing, still has not had the goodness to present me with the one who will be the mother of my children. I believe, however, that I would not be lying were I to tell you that the days spent in your company were the happiest of my life, and my only regret is to have met you in circumstances so constrained that they kept me from giving free rein to the feelings that enslaved my heart every time you were near me. I also recall with gratitude our walk along the seashore on that moonlit night, the distant guitar, and what happened next. I cannot stop thinking what a pity it is that faraway America insists on robbing us of excellent wives and future mothers." This is a letter that he never writes. Business consumes him when he arrives back to home. He recalls that there's a shipment waiting there at the port that he needs to get in. The goods are going to go to waste, and then there are some legal issues, and eventually it's time to sit down and write that love letter and he never can recall what he was supposed to write. We learn of a later affair that he has that runs on for a long time. And again, we see that there's a selfishness that resides within this character. And so we're constantly questioning, who is Senhor Nepomuceno? We started with his will and testament, in which great revelations were revealed. But as we unspool his life, we start to get at this idea that who he saw himself as and who everyone around him saw him as is not necessarily the same person. And where does his identity reside? That question is left for us as readers. But it's an interesting book. And it's one I would recommend folks reading. It certainly reminded me of the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas by Machado de Assis. It's not as laugh out loud funny as this book, and it's not postmodern and strange and fascinating, but there is a very similar question around who is this person that we're remembering. Certainly, I think there's a sense of Italo Calvino's style. Perhaps The Baron in the Trees. I know there have been comparisons to his novel, Mr. Palomar, but this might be another one that compares well. And absolutely, Zeno's Conscience, or The Confessions of Zeno by Italo Svevo. This is certainly a precursor in some ways for what Almeida was working on in this book. I would add as well Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and even the London Journal of James Boswell. And in particular, the way that these two individuals sort of view the women in their books and in their lives, I think parallels the way Senhor Nepomuceno was viewing the women in his life. Finally, another work that has sort of that humane sense of humor, but also this question around how reliable is this narrator, would be the various Macrol novels by Alvaro Mutis. So let me know if you've read anything else by Almeida. I'll be curious to find out more about his work. So hope everybody's doing well. Thank you.